Hi, everyone. Thank you again for being for this new session. This one in particular, which I'm very, very excited about. I don't think that I need to give an introduction because I think that people will be watching already know who's the one in front of me. The brother I have in front of me is an author, a comedian, an E-class celebrity, and soon to be a B-class celebrity. Just kidding. A TV presenter known for his deep analysis of Hollywood, geopolitics, culture, and theology, and also known by some as a KGB agent. Also kidding. His graduate work focused on psychological warfare and film, and he is the author of two books, Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2. He is the co-creator and co-host of the television show Hollywood Decoded. Also on his channel, he has countless film reviews where he extrapolates the subliminal messages that are hidden in the movies. He has been featured on numerous popular shows and podcasts and in debates with some of the world's top debaters, defending, explicating, intellectualizing, and disambiguating the Christian Orthodox Church, putting the best of what atheism and Islam has to offer to shame in a formidable fashion, my subjective opinion. While most of us are spending time on Netflix, he is in his books, sharpening his mind, edifying Christians throughout the world, all for the veneration and glorification of our triune God on the public stage. Jay Dyer, great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. I'm glad to talk apologetics and philosophy and all those things you mentioned. So I never get tired of talking about it.
Yeah. I would be lying through my teeth if I would say that I've seen all your sessions. There are a lot of materials. Those are long sessions, but nevertheless very fruitful. And like I knew your material for about like 3 years, and ever since I was watching your content, I was like, wait a minute, this guy is on a different level. Meaning, I was watching like Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Matt Dillahunty, and all of a sudden I saw that he did an analysis, which is known for Jay's analysis. And all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, these guys were like the best of the best, but the way he's explaining with fallacies and quote unquote arguments and objections just made more sense to me. And then, I went into the rabbit hole of Jay's analysis. And the thing which I really admire about you is that you really are familiar with your work. You really do the research. I really do think that one of the challenges in this day and age is keeping our attention and focusing it on something, then speak after it. And we have a lot of emotions here, but all of a sudden it seems like you have been training it in such a way that, you're a walking library if it comes to an array of subjects. I know for a fact that I can touch on different subjects, but I want to touch on this particular one, which is like muscular Christianity. I really do think that a lot of Christians are very defensive and they're like, nah, I don't know that. But I do believe, just as the session before between you and Sir Finn Hamilton, he said that the best defense is offense. And when atheists come to your show or to debate you, all of a sudden they don't know what's happening to them. And that says a lot, I think. And I think that you do it masterfully, and it's something very important that all Christians, who at least who feel inclined and then it feels that put in their heart to do so. And that's a passion of yours. Correct?
Well, thank you. Yeah, those are kind words. I really appreciate that. Yep. Definitely. I've had enough debates with atheists that I don't really hear anything new. So it's kind of become a thing that is just, it's literally probably 1,000 debates with atheists in the last 20 years. So I've heard every, I think, possible objection out there. And what I always say is that atheism is a very limiting system. So it kind of boxes you into a very finite, limited number of options that you can take when it comes to a worldview. So, you're only going to have a few options when it comes to knowledge or epistemology, a few options in terms of metaphysics, and a few options in ethics. So the arguments are almost always kind of prepackaged, and usually they're just rehashed things from the last few centuries. So, I don't remember the last time I've heard an atheist give like a sophisticated argument, because they're all pretty much just the same.
Yeah, the last thing you said really alludes to my first question, which is, Can you explain what the epistemological mistakes are when atheists try to explain objective truth using empiricist data?
Sure. So it's kind of a mixed bag on the question of objective truth. I would say that usually the atheists are probably half and half. There's probably half of a percentage, 50% believe that there is objective truth, right? Where, the idea that truth's not dependent upon my perspective, my subjective preferences, my tastes, that it's actually something that's a publicly accessible and known fact, truth, proposition, state of affairs. So about half of them don't. That's very easy to refute that, because that's just sort of a really basic relativism, which is self-refuting. And then maybe another 50% will think that there is a factual truth. And again, I would say out of the totality of atheists, again, I know I was splitting it up into 50-50, but out of the totality of atheists, probably 95 to 99% believe in empiricism, that knowledge is really only attainable through sense data. So there's no other way to know. There's no other means, no other source. And typically man is seen as a tabula rasa. This is, again, just kind of repeating the Enlightenment worldview in anthropology. So that being the case, again, the position is very limited. It's very boxed in. And this is where somebody like David Hume comes into play, because he's kind of the classic atheist who is consistent with his atheism. So he takes skepticism to the logical conclusion. And we know the atheists are always wanted to be logical. They're always wanted to cheer on and claim that they, basically own logic, they own reason, and everyone else is superstitious. But what we actually find out is that atheism rests on some very unprovable presuppositions and assumptions, at least not empirically demonstrable or provable. And you just mentioned one of those key ones, which is the idea that if you adopt empiricism, and I'm not talking about just believing and learning things through empirical sense data, but the school of philosophy, the view of epistemology, the view of anthropology that comes out of the Enlightenment, that we only know what we know just from bare sense data. It's very easy to refute that. It's a very fundamentally contradictory and self-refuting position. And one easy way to show that is the proposition itself, that we only know what we know through sense data, is not itself a proposition that's within our sense data or known by sense data. Because for one, it claims to have universal status, right? All human beings only, you could phrase it different ways, but it has that universal quantifier that we only know what we know through sense data. So you can't actually know that through sense data, right? So there's multiple problems with that starting point. But most atheists, materialists, most modern people, thinkers, start with that presupposition. So yes, like you said, it's self-refuting on the face of it, because you can't actually know that or prove that or demonstrate that on atheist empiricist grounds. So we're not talking about, do we learn things through sense data? We're talking about the philosophy of empiricism, which is a specific position coming out of the Enlightenment with people like Locke, Berkeley, and Hume.
Yeah. That's what you mentioned before, where that atheists claim logic and reason, like that's our domain. Can't touch that particular part, but that's actually surface level. Like when I hear people say, like, yeah, but now by science we know, and we know what's happening now with the God of the gaps type of stuff, and I'm like, those are actually appeals from silence. Those are really like claims I'm really thinking about. Like, first off, when you're claiming that God is wrong because if he does X, Y, and Z, first off, it's your subjective opinion, but you claim to use science and reason, for instance. But how do you actually explain that? And the only thing that they mainly do is God dooms people to hell, and it's hot in hell, and which God does that, and these type of stuff. And I'm like, you're not addressing the point. And people like Sam Harris or Matt Dillahunty, the only thing they say is, I'm not convinced. Yeah, we don't care if you're convinced or not. But
right, that's a biographical detail. It doesn't really enter into the status of an argument. So what you're hitting on there is poor argumentation. And this is something we see all the time in atheism. And to be fair, there's quite a few theists, Christians who are also poor critical thinkers as well. So they often give bad arguments. So there's bad arguments on both sides. And one of the bad arguments that you alluded to at the beginning would be, it's kind of a common, it's Father Deacon Dr. Ananias and I always joke about this, that people call it, they're always just saying, well, now we now know this. Nowadays we know this. Yeah, that's really a meaningless phrase, right? That's a combination of two fallacies. It's a appeal to the masses and appeal to authority. We now know who's the we. Is this 51% of the intellectuals, 51% of biologists? Is it 75%? I mean, it's just so arbitrary and absurd. It should be obvious to anyone that knows informal fallacies that to say we now know XYZ doesn't count as any kind of argument. It's an informal fallacy. It's a combination of those two that I mentioned. And so obviously it's a terrible argument. But we hear it all the time. I don't know why people think this is a convincing thing. It's really more of a rhetoric, because it's more of almost a kind of an emotional appeal to like, well, you don't want to be part of the, superstitious dumb crowd, right? Don't you want to be part of the in crowd of the sophisticated people with high IQs? So that's it's a version of that, which is yet another fallacy, emotional appeal. So, just knowing basic informal fallacies is very helpful in these types of discussions, because 90%, I'm guessing, 90%, 95% of atheists, online atheists, people that you're going to encounter, they don't know any of the fallacies. That's been my experience 95% of the time. And yet they're claiming to have, cornered the market on reason. I mean, there's no way to have cornered the market on reason and reasoning skills if you don't know the fallacies, right? That'd be like saying, I don't know what the law code is, but I'm a lawyer, right? I mean, it would be absurd. It makes no sense. So I always try to bring the apologetic discussion back to the analogy of the courtroom. And what's on trial in the courtroom is worldviews. Do the worldviews that we have, Christian, atheist, Buddhist, whatever, Muslim, do they stand up in the courtroom? The court of appeal, the status is logic itself, reasoning, right? The principles of philosophy that everyone agrees to by default when they come to the table to do a debate. And yeah, I mean, granted, there are atheists, there are philosophers who will disagree. Oh, there are no logical laws. And that's very easy to refute, right? So if there's no logic, then you can't actually argue against logic. This is an old argument that Aristotle in book 3 or 4 of the Metaphysics uses against the sophists, which is to say that you're already assuming and using the thing that you're denying, right? So if you argue against logic, you're using logic to argue. So that's a type of transcendental argument, presuppositional argument, I think. And so that's one of the ways that, if somebody wants to be kind of a smart ass and they come to the table and say, well, I don't actually believe in logic. I had a debate with a kind of well-known atheist a while back, JF, and that was kind of the route that JF took. JF said, I do not believe in logic, right? And it's like, well, then you're not going to be able to debate, right? I mean, if you don't think that there's objective principles of rules, logic, critical thinking that undergird argumentation, then it's not possible to give reasons for beliefs. And that's what we're getting into when it comes to debates, which is what you alluded to towards the end of your last question or comment, was what it means to justify it, right? All that means really is to give a coherent, grounded account for why we believe what we believe. What are the reasons to believe what we believe? And so that's why apologetics and epistemology are kind of closely connected, because we want to have good reasons to believe what we believe. Otherwise, why not believe something crazy? Why not be in a cult, right? I mean, cults have reasons for why the cult members believe what the cult, but they're bad reasons, right? It's usually something that equates to a fallacy. Why do you think the cult is true? Well, because I met the leader and he gave me a warm, fuzzy feeling when we talked. Well, that's not a good reason to believe, in the crazy cult worldview, right? So that's why we need good reasons to believe, to give an account for our faith, to, as you said, give an answer for the hope that is within us. And one last thing I'll say is that another way that we need to be able to give good reasons, not just any reasons, but good reasons, is that you can have a true belief for bad reasons. For example, you know, Father Deacon loves the analogy of, well, what if I said, you know, something uncontroversial, like I like to wash my hands, but the reason that I do it, which we all agree we should wash our hands after using the bathroom or whatever, the reason I wash my hands is because Little Wayne came to me in a dream and said, wash your hands. Is that a good reason to have the belief that we should all wash our hands? No, it's not, because I could have a dream tomorrow that tells me to not wash my hands. So I could have a dream, you know, it's a bad reason for something that's a true belief or something that we should do, right? So that's why we need to have in classic in medieval philosophy, they talk about justified true belief. So we want to have good explanatory, justificatory power behind the reasons for our beliefs. And they need to be coherent. They need to mesh well with the other beliefs and reasons.
Ever since I heard the concept of fallacies, which was always present there with me, but I did buy this book. I don't know if you know it. Perhaps you do, but I've bought this book from Dr. Bo Bennett, 300 fallacies. Like these are like ad hominem fallacies, lucid fallacies, like 300 of them with the examples and how to refute them and how to explain them.
I'm sure that would be a great book. In fact, I might actually get that book because I've been looking for a good book that lists, you know, quite a few of them. A lot of times you get like atheist websites that kind of actually don't do a good job of giving examples, because the atheist, you know, fallacy lists and sites, they'll actually put anything to do with theism as a fallacy, which is not true. But that's one of the difficult things about philosophy, is that it's really impossible to have a purely objective, neutral place in philosophy. There's no way to not have presuppositions, to not have biases. And as a presuppositionalist, that's okay. We accept that and we integrate that into our worldview as part of our system. So, but when we go to, you know, these attempts at kind of listing the fallacies from the atheist websites or Reddit or places like that, you'll get these bad examples that are not actually always fallacious, you know, because they're just trying to put theism in there anywhere they can.
Yeah, we're going to touch on the presuppositional part later on. My next question is, what can be understood by the transcendental argument and the transcendental argument for God?
Right. So transcendental arguments are a unique type of argument, a logical argument that deals with the preconditions of knowledge. So they have to do with reasoning about what things have to be the case to do reasoning at all. So they're not direct arguments, typically speaking, about this or that thing or that object. They're higher level arguments, meta level arguments, you could say, about the possibilities of how to do reasoning at all, how to have logic at all, how to have numbers, how to have, you know, anything that we claim to be the case, anything that we predicate about the world. The tree is green, right? Well, what has to be the case for me to be able to say the tree is green? So that's what we're talking about. And it's good to distinguish that a transcendental argument from other words that use transcendental in the history of philosophy or literature that confuse people. A lot of people think, oh, you're talking about Thoreau and transcendentalism. Oh, you're talking about, you know, you're a Kantian.
Word concept fallacy.
Yeah. So the word has a lot of different meanings in different contexts. So it's really, you see, for example, I mentioned earlier the type of argument in Aristotle in it's either book 3 or 4 of Metaphysics, where he is arguing against the sophists, and he says you can't argue that logic is useless, so there is no logic because you'd be using logic to do it. And he says that would be self-refuting. It's sometimes called retorsion, right? So that's a type of a transcendental argument that Aristotle does. Sometimes the transcendental categories are referred to out of the categories of Aristotle, like the being, goodness, right? These kinds of things, where something is situated. Those are also sometimes called the transcendentals. And then Kant basically takes Aristotle's metaphysical categories and turns them into a priori structures of the mind, right? And so he just basically internalizes Aristotle's objective metaphysical world and puts it into the mind, which is basically wrong. I mean, I'm not a Kantian. However, Kant does have some good arguments and points where he makes consistent and very good transcendental arguments. Now, all of those things are similar to, but not the same thing as the transcendental argument for God. And the way that I make this argument is to basically say, I'll just do it in a 3-step move. I say basically just that all knowledge, all predication, all meaningful claims or statements that humans make presuppose categories or these transcendental preconditions, the preconditions of knowledge. And so they would be things like that words have meaning, that objects have identity over time, that there's an external world, that there's a self making these predications and these statements and meanings, that the words match up to things in the world, that there are therefore universals, that these words, I'm speaking of the universal nominalism debate of the Middle Ages, that these words relate to when I pick out one from the many, right? This is the historic problem of the one of the many in philosophy. So all of these things, abstract categories, logic plays into how sentences work, linguistic philosophy. So I'm saying that all of those things are the case, even though they're not under the direct purview of my sentence, right? So my sentence, the tree is green, has nothing to do directly with those categories, but those categories have to be the case for me to make a sentence. Now, it's not only the case that the categories just are, or that they're just sort of independent things. They relate to one another. So the self relates to the act of predicating, right? To know something requires a knower, right? So there's a necessary connection between these two things. The external world is part of that, right? Predicating presupposes that the object that you're speaking of has identity over time, that it's one object out of a class of objects, right? So all of these really grandiose metaphysical claims, beliefs, presuppositions undergird just even something as simple as a sentence like the tree is green. So when we understand that all of those things don't just operate in isolation or a vacuum, they actually go together, right? You can't have an act of knowing without a knower. You can't have the external world without a knower of the external world who predicates about that world, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things hinge together in kind of a symphony of categories, and the world has to be structured a certain way for these things to be the case. For example, we couldn't have these things be the case and the world or time move in reverse, right? It wouldn't work. This would fall apart. Or we couldn't have a situation where all of these things are the case and then tomorrow there are no more universals. They just go away, right? So there has to be a subsistence of these things over time. So therefore, we need a certain kind of world, a certain kind of paradigm that can give an account for all of these very difficult, very metaphysically troubling and epistemically troubling things in the history of philosophy. And guess what? The Orthodox Christian paradigm does that very thing. It gives an account for these transcendental categories that themselves undergird any act of predication or knowledge or belief or whatever. So basically, I'm making a 3-step move. I'm saying that an act of predication presupposes these categories. And then one more step, these categories presuppose a specific worldview and God. So in other words, we can't have a world, like where there's a God, but the external world is a illusion, right? That would, again, destroy the possibility of knowledge. We can't have a God that's a pantheism. Oh, he's just everything, right? We need a world with a distinct beginning, middle, end. So we need a created world, and only the Christian worldview has creation ex nihilo, which allows for beginning, middle, and end, and thus telos, things having a purpose. Causation, telos, that's another couple categories that I should have mentioned are necessary to predicate, which cannot be proven empirically, right? Hume showed that you can't empirically demonstrate causation. You can't empirically, I'm saying the principle of causation itself. You can demonstrate that one event is followed by another event, but the metaphysical principle of causation is something that's not directly empirically perceived. That's Hume's whole argument. Just like telos is an interpretation of the phenomena, but on strictly empirical bases, you're not seeing telos, right? You're seeing this event, or you're reading into the things that they have purpose. They do have purpose, but I'm saying that on purely empiricist bases, you can't look at an object and see that it has purpose. It doesn't, the raw data doesn't tell you that, and the whole history of epistemology in the last 200 years is all about showing that there's no brute facts, right? Everything is theory laden. Anyway, so that's how we get to the triune God. And then if somebody says, well, what about a Unitarian deity? Well, there's other arguments that are sort of ancillary to that, that demonstrate that we can't have a purely Unitarian God. For example, it leads to a dyad. If you're St. Basil's Hexameron 2, he critiques Aristotle's position where the eternal first actualizer must always have something other than himself to actualize, and that would be a dyad. So if there's an eternal creation, now the created order has taken on one of the divine attributes, eternality. So it's not really created. It's just as it's as eternal as God is eternally actualizing. So he must always, if he was always the eternal actualizer, then he must always have had the opposite of himself to actualize, and that's what the Aristotelian position says. That's not the Christian view, right? The Christian view is not that there's two eternal principles, God and world, right? That's not a creation ex nihilo, and that's why we can't adopt Aristotle's definitional approach to the eternal actualizer.
Yeah, because human beings with their limited noetic sense data, they cannot understand the metaphysical side. So there is this thing called general revelation, and there's also this thing called special revelation. These are completely different things, not necessarily this one will also be something we'll touch on later on. But if it comes to the eternality that you just mentioned, really does make sense, because when people say like the Father is the uncaused first cause, and how can it be that the Son is eternally begotten, and it doesn't that necessarily mean that the Son doesn't have aseity, for instance. We already touched this one with Dr. Bo Branson with the monarchy of the Father, which also is a huge subject in and of itself. I'm gonna get.
Well, I agree with. I'm familiar with the whole issue and that whole debate, and I agree with Dr. Branson's positions. And so, as you know, I'm an Orthodox Christian, so I'm going to defend the Orthodox position. So, the idea that the Son has aseity of himself is a Calvinist doctrine. It is not the doctrine of Nicaea or any of the church fathers. The Orthodox position from Nicaea all the way up to the Synodicon of Orthodoxy makes it very clear that everything that the Son has is given to him, communicated to him by the Father. That's the meaning of being eternally begotten. So when Jesus says, all that the Father has, he's given to the Son, the works the Father has, I also do likewise. Works, the things that are given to him would be all of the divine powers that he has, and power signifies nature. And so thus the divine essence is communicated from the person of the Father to the person of the Son. So there is no notion of the Son being ase. That would be to confuse the Father's hypostatic property and giving it to the Son.
Your debate with Sheikh Ashrar Rashid, which was a very fascinating one, because his starting point was that some Aborigine or someone in the Amazon jungle, for instance, he wouldn't come up with the Trinity. But okay, wait a minute. Then you are using the creation to explain the creator. So then you're committing shirk or likening creation with God. Isn't that something that is counter towards your position? And there it's, then we do actually see that the Trinitarian doctrine, for instance, is as biblical as it gets, but that's just a different subject. My next question. How has Christianity built up the West over thousands of years, and how has and is atheism unknowingly destroying it?
Well, I would like to touch on one thing you mentioned in passing, which was the notion of general revelation and special revelation. So typically those are terms that are used in Protestant theology. But I think the better terminology for Orthodoxy would be natural revelation and special revelation. You could say special revelation or just revelation. Sure. supernatural revelation and natural revelation. And that's I use that terminology to distinguish it from Thomistic natural theology. So in Father Sten Eloy's Orthodox Dogmatics Volume 1, he has a really good discussion of this issue where he points out that we really can't do natural theology in the Thomistic scheme because that's bound up with a certain anthropology, certain doctrine of created grace that is unique to Thomism. And by extension, I think Roman Catholicism as well, given what their dogmas say. But I just wanted to be clear that it's not, the Orthodox view is not the Calvinist view.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for correcting me. Like one of the persons that made me an Orthodox as well. Like I was born out of the Orthodox Armenian Church, and now I'm somewhat going back again. So thank you for correcting me.
Well, I just want to be precise. I don't know, I know you said that you're moving towards Orthodoxy, but I didn't know if that meant you are Orthodox or in process or exactly.
Let's just say if a random person asks me about a certain Orthodox doctrine or something to explain, I do believe it in my heart, but I would still like, wait a minute, I don't have the entire knowledge I have. I do have some books about patristics and this type of stuff, but I don't want to give my my opinion if I haven't believed it fully yet. I would say,
I wasn't trying to call you out. I just didn't know exactly what your position was.
I'm Orthodox as pretty much good. I've never had something with Protestantism or something, but yeah, the Orthodoxy all the way through. But still a lot to learn. But going back to the question, we do know that the Judeo-Christian tradition has made the West what it is, and there are lots of attacks. There's like, oh, the patriarchy, oh, the Christianity. Like we need to like break this whole thing down and rebuild it back up again under the realm of atheism. So my question is, how do you actually foresee the fact that atheism unknowingly is actually destroying the West? Like the family structure is being attacked, marriages, etc., abortions, and under the umbrella of humanists. We are humanists, but then you're doing all these atrocities not knowingly. So how do you actually?
Well, this is a good example of how there is no neutrality, right? I mean, one thing that Thomism or natural theology or evidentialist apologetics or bad argumentation in the domain of debates that we engage in, one thing that it's predicated on is the notion of there being neutral ground, that causation, telos, existence, earthworms, they mean the exact same thing to the atheists as they do to us. So when we find the common ground, we just stack a bunch of things that we have in common, and then maybe at the end of it we can get them to agree to there being a first cause. That's not what the biblical approach, what the apostles preached, what the Revelation says about the natural man. The Revelation says the natural man can't receive the things of the Spirit, says that it's foolishness to him, says that, for example, you can't interpret the world without revelation because, for example, the world as it is now is fallen. So the fall is a doctrine of revealed theology. That's in Genesis, okay? So in terms of natural theology, you can't take things from revealed theology and apply those to natural theology or first principles, right? That's something you do later down the road, and that's based on faith, not on reason, scientia, and demonstration. So my point with all that is just to say that the theology trek that the West took is partly to blame for what happened in the West. This is why St. Gregory Palamas says to Barlaam, if you take the presuppositions that you have, if you go down the road, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, what he says to Barlaam in the debate with Barlaam. He says, if you go down this route, you will end up in atheism. And that's precisely what the West did. The West went that route. It adopted created grace. It adopted natural theology. It adopted the rejection of the nous, rejection of the cosmic scope of Christ's incarnation and redemption. It rejected, all of these uncreated grace, the energies. It rejected all these things that make Orthodox Christianity what they are, that gives God an eminence in creation. And so it's not surprising that it would logically move from Occam's nominalism to Aquinas's via media, which is basically a type of nominalism, which would then move to the Enlightenment era of skepticism and empiricism, because Aquinas' theology is an empirical theology. This leads to empiricism. This leads to atheism. So it basically cuts God off from the here and the now. The world becomes, as we know from the Enlightenment, a machine in motion. It's just the universe is just a giant machine. That's why they were principally at that time deists. So they basically, God steps out of the picture. He starts the machine, steps back out of it, and then the machine runs down on entropy to, you know, its own destruction or whatever. But then eventually, within a century or two, they just said, well, there's no point in having the first cause at all. We don't even need that. We don't know it. We can't justify it. So just throw out God to begin with. So there's a logical progression ideologically of the West in terms of its presuppositions, and it takes centuries for it to work itself out. But it's just coming to the materialist atheist conclusions of the 19th, 20th century are the end result of the medieval nominalist assumptions and presuppositions 1,000 years earlier. It's just taken that long to get to the final point of, oh, okay, well, no, we're just atheists. It's just nothing, meaningless.
Yeah.
Anyway, so point being is that you can't be neutral. There is no neutrality in the sense that you can't adopt, for example, an atheist position and it not affect your morals. You can't be, I'm going to adopt materialism, atheism, but I'm going to have a strong belief in the family unit and ethics and sexual morals. Or no, it's not going to happen. It's going to inevitably affect the entire paradigm. And it might not even be your generation. Maybe your generation doesn't go to the end results of the atheism of a generation or a century prior. But this is what Father Starr from Rose is talking about in his book Nihilism, where he talks about the process of the revolutionary philosophy. So in the first stages of revolution, it's very glowing and progressive and positive, and we're going to evolve to this utopia. It's going to be great. And then they realize within a generation or two, they come to the conclusion, actually the revolution didn't produce what we wanted. It actually led to bloodshed, millions dead. So then you get a depression phase, and then the revolution goes into its next stage. And then this progresses. I think he just kind of roughly gives 4 stages. And then the final stage of revolution is nihilism, nothing, because it doesn't achieve anything and it's purely satanic, and it becomes chaos for chaos sake. That's the fullest expression of Black nihilism.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a racial sense. I'm just talking about just totally demonic, energized destruction for destruction's sake. Because the whole project ultimately was spurred on by the satanic destructive spirit. It was always about destruction, but men fell prey to the allure, the promise, right? Just like in the garden. Oh, you'll be like a god. You'll determine right and wrong. You'll make your own reality. And then what does it lead to? Death, chaos, destruction.
That's something I do come across so many times. I was as shameful as it actually is, I was a former New Ager. I really did believe, I was a nominal Christian who really did believe like we are all gods and that type of nonsense. And like, God didn't want that man would have knowledge, but Satan did. Satan is our friend. Like, do you like the stupidity of that thought that it really had me in its grips? For instance, I do understand that a lot of people do fall for it. And I'm not saying that I just leaped over them, that I'm so super intelligent, but I do understand why people fall in that particular trap. And when I do, for instance, listen to atheists that came from Christianity, for instance, one time I did respond back to good luck with nihilism. And that's for some type of reason that really bothered them, because they knew that I struck a nerve with them. So my next question actually goes beyond what you just said, is why do you think that the most Christians turning atheists come under the umbrella of Protestantism? I hear a lot of ex-Christians describe themselves from Protestant-like backgrounds. I'm not trying to bash Protestants. Of course, Orthodoxy or Catholicism have their own atheists, but why do you mainly think that under that umbrella, there's this type of fruit coming out?
I would say just due probably on the face of it to the deficiencies in Protestantism. So, I mean, there's going to be deficiencies in Rome as well as Protestantism. But the deficiencies in Protestantism are such that they probably give rise to atheism quicker than maybe Rome, although maybe Francis is going to make that no longer the case. I mean, I think he's turning out quite a few atheists, maybe to compete with the Protestants. But I think the nature of Protestantism is such that it is kind of grounded in a rejection of the intellectual. Now, that's not to say that every Protestant has been anti-intellectual, but if you go back to Luther, if you go back to Calvin, the classical reformers, their initial stance, even though it was very academic, was anti-scholastic. Now, I'm not into Western scholasticism, but the move against scholastics in the reformers, I think, sets the stage for the removal of philosophy and academia having a relevance to theology. So then what happens is within a generation or two, you've got the people who split. They go into two directions in Protestantism. They either go into what's called Protestant scholasticism, where they try to give a really super intellectual, almost like scholasticism view of what Protestant faith is, or you get pietism. And pietism is the flight in the opposite direction, being more consistent with the two sides of that dialectic in Protestantism already. Are we going to be super intellectual philosophers, or are we going to be pietistic fideists who don't do any philosophy and we just follow the Bible or something like this, or we just pray or something like that, right? So you get Protestantism going in two different directions pretty early on, pretty quickly. And we see, for example, in Germany, German pietism and going in this direction, and the movements that just totally reject anything to do with philosophy, apologetics, that kind of stuff, metaphysics. Or we get these really high-minded people who then soon are so rational that they deconstruct the whole Bible. So we get higher criticism, right? Anyway, so I'm rambling, but
no.
All of that is just to say that that would just be my surface guess as to why Protestantism does that, because from the outset, within a couple generations, it was already. So once you critique the church, which is what gives you the scriptures, historically, it's only one step away from then critiquing the scriptures.
That's a great point.
And then that underdoes the whole thing. So there's already a shortcut to atheism from the outset of the beginnings of Protestantism. Wow. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I do agree with that particular part, but then I am of the opinion that Protestantism is a lot like going through the motions, and Orthodox is like the full thing, like the whole experience. Like, or you can watch like a movie, or you can go to the theater. Like the experience is very different. Going through the same old motions. I do love the Protestant. I do believe that a lot of fruits came out of it. Like, for instance, R.C. Sproul, I love the man. I really, till this day, I still watch his lectures, his way of teaching stuff. But there are some stuff that he says that I'm like the Bible is an infallible collection of, no, wait, the Bible is a fallible collection of infallible books. I remember that you once upon a time addressed a particular point. I was like, wait a minute, that sounds dumb. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I think that there are these kind of, Protestantism locked itself into that position that its whole foundation was basically anti-Rome, right? So to be anti-Rome is to be sola scriptura, to be sola gratia, sola fide, right? Sola Christos, all of these solas of the Reformation. So you're kind of locked into that. And so if you depart from any of those solas, in their mindset, you're already just on the way back to Rome. So they didn't really have a notion of Orthodox Christianity. I mean, there was a little bit of dialogue between some reformers and Orthodox, but I mean, Luther made it such a kind of a all or nothing thing that, it was like anybody who preaches law doesn't preach Christ. The Orthodox Church preaches law and works, so they don't preach Christ. I mean, Luther would really set it up in these either or dialectics. Calvinism is another step further, which is, even further removing the immanence of God's energies and God's presence, for example, in the Eucharist, right? I mean, Calvin went further and said, no, it's not even the real presence of the flesh and blood. It's just a spiritual presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So we have, and with Calvin, you get the divorcing of the presence of the Holy Spirit in baptism as well. So Luther believed in a kind of real presence and a baptismal regeneration. So he still understood that, you know, for him, he at least wanted to have a union between the sacrament and the grace of the sacrament. But Calvin has already begun the next phase to split those two. So now the water baptism is not directly connected to the regeneration of the Holy Spirit. The Lord's Supper is not any kind of like actual body and blood. It's just the Spirit, the Holy Spirit in some special way. So again, we have like gradations and moves away. And then of course, after, you've got Zwingli and you've got Anabaptists, right? And they go even further. So moving away from, you know, what was what you could say as, I guess, the remnants of the Latin Catholic tradition. But of course, what they're rejecting is the Frankish Latin papal church of the Middle Ages. So, you know, that was something that the Orthodox Church had already rejected centuries earlier. So it was an overreaction to something bad.
So I would say like one of the main reasons why I became an Orthodox and not Protestant was several reasons. But the main thing was that when you proclaim that you love Christ, then you keep his commandments. And one of his commandments was to follow the apostles. And when it comes to Luther and Zwingli and Calvin, for instance, all of a sudden, no, the true teaching of Christ, then it started. Like, wait a minute, then you just negated with all the things that came before it. Like, I'm not a man of traditions, but wait a minute, I'm a Calvinist, then you're following the traditions of Calvin. Like, I don't see how obviously people don't get it. And I do believe that there is so much richness all the way throughout the patristic era, which the allegory that they gave to Branson, for instance, was like the Bible is like your favorite show on Netflix, with seasons, with episodes and all that type of stuff. It has like a chronology and the storyline. And all of a sudden, like the final season has happened. And you have like these spin-offs, church fathers, and all of them have like, it's still history. It's still influence on the church, for instance. And to negate that, that's something that you're somewhat saying that Christ failed to preserve his church. And yeah, I came into to save everything. It really does bother me. Like, I love my Protestant brothers, but that just like.
Well, it's a Nestorian ecclesiology. So it's a denial of the principles of the incarnation for the body of Christ, which is the extension of the incarnation. The church is his mystical body. And so the Christological doctrines of the church fathers that apply to Christ himself, all of those great, creedal statements and dogmatic statements from Ephesus to Chalcedon to Constantinople 1, 2, 3, and even the Icon Council, they all relate directly to all of the other doctrines. So the way that you understand Christology is going to necessarily affect and determine your doctrine of the sacraments, right? So for example, in Ephesus, St. Cyril argues on the basis of Christology, on the basis of the Eucharist to prove Christology, and vice versa. You can argue back and forth because the principles are going to be the same. The uncreated energies that deify the human nature of Christ is the same energies that we participate in the transformed elements that become the body, blood, soul, and energy or divinity of God, of Christ. So you're going to have a doctrine of Christology that conditions and makes sense of the sacraments, and by extension, the principle of deification in the elements in terms of the bread and wine. It's the same principle in the body of church. The church is participating in the uncreated energies because that's his body. That's how we're made whole. That's how we're healed and so forth, is being in that body and then participating in that Eucharist in that body. So, and by extension, that same doctrine of the interpenetration of the energies, the immanent presence of the energies, is what conditions and makes sense of our eschatology. So the other churches or sects or groups, they don't have that doctrine, and that is the correct doctrine. It's not up for debate what eschatology is or what sacramentology is or what the doctrine of grace is. No, it's already settled a long time ago. It's the uncreated grace of God, distinct from the essence of God, and it's the personal energies that we know God through, revealed in the person of Christ.
Yeah, correct. A question from a friend of mine. What do you say about the Orthodox persons who say that you won't be safe if you become an Orthodox? It's a somewhat of a rhetorical question, but he wanted me to ask you this.
Well, I would say that normatively speaking, that is the case. And if God extends his grace and makes up for what's lacking in people who didn't know any better, that kind of a thing, that's up to God. So I don't know. It's not my position to make that judgment call. That's up to God. Paul says, what have we to do with judging those that are without? We judge those that are within. So, that's up to God. That's between them. All I know is that it's our duty to tell people that they have to come to the Orthodox Church. So if you're outside the ark, right, the Orthodox Church is the ark. There's a great icon, which is the boat that is the Orthodox Church. I mean, if you're outside that, you're in troubled waters and seas, and you'll probably sink. And that's precisely, that answers your question earlier about atheism. I mean, why do so many Protestants, Roman Catholics, they depart and they become atheists? It can happen amongst Orthodox too, because we have free will, but those other groups don't. It's like a city with one real hospital and a bunch of fake hospitals. So could you get some true advice at a fake hospital? Yeah. Could you get some good medicine at a fake hospital? Maybe. But why wouldn't you go to like the real hospital? So
great explanation. Like I knew, for instance, like this book of Father Seraphim Rose, he explained like you need to treat the non-Orthodox person as people who don't know Orthodoxy yet. So like I do really sense, like if I'm like on Clubhouse or Discord or whatever, I do sense that from the Orthodox perspective, there's a lot of polemic towards, not in a bad ill way, but they do really want to show you how it's done, but in a good sense. And that's something that caught the attention of one of my friends. Like, hey, I'm do sensing that. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that our Discord is actually geared towards polemics. So the reason why there's a lot of polemics is that it's a polemics-based Discord. So, not everybody has to do that. Not everybody's called to do debate. Not everybody has to do it the way we do it. But that's just the way that it is in there, because it is specifically a debate-oriented server. But no, we don't. We're not like mean to Protestants, generally speaking. And I think that that's the right basic approach, is to treat people in that way, like Father Seraphim Rose says, unless they demonstrate obstinacy and willful opposition and willful ignorance and so forth. At that point, it's no longer goodwill or just merely invincible ignorance. It's actually obstinacy.
Yeah. The other question from another friend of me. Well, we do know, for instance, that this sounds like a bash Protestantism kind of session, but we do know, for instance, that within Protestantism there are also many denominations in of themselves. But his question was, how do you see the fact there were also schismatic moments in history concerning the Eastern Orthodoxy and Oriental Orthodoxy? Like, did patriarchs in the Eastern Church like misuse their power, or certain creeds that weren't accepted? How do you actually foresee the schismatic times within Orthodoxy?
Well, so anybody that schisms from the church is no longer in the church. So the Coptics and the Orientals are not Orthodox. They are Orthodox, so-called. They might have that in their name, but no, they have a defective Christology. They have a defective many other areas. They do many things that are not Orthodox. They practice things like circumcision, animal sacrifice, a lot of these sort of Judaized tendencies that the church has long ago moved past. So I'm not saying that everybody in those groups is inherently evil. Again, I'm not trying to make a judgment call on individuals, but I'm saying that, speaking of the groups, the Orthodox Church has already stated in her councils and her dogmas how to view those groups. And the groups as a whole have defective heterodox beliefs. So again, it's just my duty simply to discuss with those people, which is what we do when we invite them to Discord. We invite them to discuss, their Christology, these issues, the energies, whatever the issue is. And then we tell them to become Orthodox.
Yeah. like I do remember, like one of my favorite doctrines is theosis. Like that, just I'm just loving it. But I was shocked for the fact that Pope Shenouda, the Pope of Alexandria, or the Patriarch of Alexandria, to be more specific,
that's to the Coptics, not for us.
Correct. Yeah, I know, but that he negated theosis, and he is somewhat of like if it comes to the apostolic succession, he's like the follow-up of Athanasius.
Yeah, it sounded like it. I've read the essay. It sounds like it's written by James White. I mean, it's baffling to me how anyone could think that's orthodox. It's just so far from. I mean, Saint Athanasius talks about deification, theosis all the time, and this guy's supposed to be
the Son of God became Son of Man, so that sons of men shall become sons of God. How is that?
I mean, yeah, and this guy's supposed to be the successor to Athanasius. It's just like such a fundamental level of ignorance. It's kind of staggering, but yeah, I mean, and there's other things you could point to with they're just confused and kind of simplistic Christology, I guess is one way to put it.
Yeah, there are a handful of subjects. My other question, this is actually an amalgamation of two in one. How do you amalgamate the Ventilian way of presuppositional apologetics with orthodoxy? In other words, how do you reason in a circle with objective truth in mind?
Well, first thing is that everybody admits from the church fathers that the source of an argument has nothing to do with the truth or falsity of an argument. So the fact that Van Til says this or Bahnsen says this has nothing to do with whether it's true or false. That would be the genetic fallacy. I don't know why people can't figure this out, right? That the fact that Van Til made an argument, again, has nothing to do with whether it's true or false. I mean, the church fathers utilize arguments from all kinds of ridiculous pagan figures, right? I mean, we've got arguments from Aristotle, from Plato, from Porphyry, from Plotinus, right? So, I mean, they're just as heterodox. They're more heterodox than Van Til. So are we going to toss out all of those arguments if the basis for who we accept is whether they're Protestant or, I mean, these people are pagans. So I mean, it's like Roman Catholics usually voice this objection that you can't use this argument because Van Til said he was a Calvinist. Well, it's just stupid, right?
Yeah.
So now if the argument is that you can't use the argument because it's reformed in terms of its theology and presupposition, that's different from saying that it's bad because it's from Van Til. So they would need to demonstrate how that's the case. I don't see how that's the case because it really isn't. I mean, why would we not want a really good argument? I mean, why would we not want to use an argument that moves us in the direction of proving the Trinity, especially given the fact that we've had, centuries of using these really bad arguments that atheists don't even find convincing anymore. So, I mean, they oftentimes, people who object to this argument want to use pragmatic arguments. Well, this is an intensely pragmatic argument. It makes more converts, typically speaking, than these tired, rehashed, centuries old classical evidentialist arguments that are not very good arguments. So again, it's very difficult, I think, for people to, number one, understand the argument, and then number two, get away from just sort of appeals to tradition. So, I mean, there's a valid place for tradition, obviously, but I mean, at what point is an appeal to tradition when, you've got tons of people relying on Aristotle, relying on bad arguments in Plotinus, relying on bad arguments in any other number of pagan philosophers? I mean, for example, if you look at the early apologists, I mean, many of them ended up heterodox. They're not even in the church. People like Tatian, for example. So their stupid apologetic took them so far as to leave the church because they had a wrong foundation, a wrong presupposition, and they ended up in heterodox groups because they were following, quote, Greek wisdom and philosophy and bad argumentation. So we want to be thoroughly Trinitarian and Christological in our apologetic. I don't understand why people think that Christology and revealed theology isn't going to affect our epistemology and our apologetics. I mean, it's really a no-brainer. But so the way that I would say it doesn't relate to Van Til is that it's not a question of the soundness of the argument itself or whether the argument itself is valid, but it's a question of Well, did Van Til and Bahnsen have erroneous theological views that skewed or didn't allow them to make the argument as well as it could be made? And that's the way I view it. I view it that this is a great argument. It's a objectively, philosophically, logically solid argument, but it does need to be purified of the the Trinitarian, basically, errors and mistakes that Bahnsen and Van Til had, typically, which could be summarized by just the default Augustinian positions of absolute divine simplicity, filioque way, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a great point, because then it becomes an either or dialectic. Like, wait a minute, or you're a Calvinist, or you're Van Tilian, or you're Orthodox, or you're not a Calvinist. Like, but then it actually becomes chewing out the meat, spitting out the bone. I really do like.
Well, I mean, so Augustine, for example, he read and used commentaries and theological. This is more important. This is more central to our faith than philosophy. He used commentaries of a Donatist. Okay, the Cappadocians read and used arguments in philosophy and commentaries from Origen. Does that mean that I have to accept Origenism? Does that mean I have to accept everything in Origen? No. So again, the source has nothing to do with the truth or falsity. I mean, Judas can say something true, right? And it's true or false, irrespective of the wickedness of Satan. Can say things true, right? So
separating the message from the messenger. That's
and that's, again, that's a, it's something basic to philosophy. People who know basic philosophy should know that. That should be something well known. I should add too that it's not just, by the way, a doctrine of purifying Van Til or Bahnsen from erroneous Trinitarian theology. Obviously, by extension, they would have other doctrines that we would reject, such as their doctrine total depravity, which affects their epistemology. They would say that the noetic effects of sin are such that sin is always messing up my interpretation and my knowledge. That would actually undercut the entire point of the transcendental argument, because the transcendental argument is arguing that you actually know this to be the case, and it's necessarily so, and it can't be otherwise. But to say that would be impossible if the noetic effects of sin were always making you potentially wrong, fallible, etc. So yes, there's obviously the anthropology is wrong, the soteriology is wrong, but if we clean out all of that, the argument itself that knowledge itself presupposes the triune God, I don't see why would we not want to use that kind of an argument?
Great point. I do want to dissect into this other quote unquote issue. For the past, I don't know what it is, like 1 year, 1.5 years, you've delved a bit more into Islam, and you had debates with Shabir Ali, Sheikh Asrar Rashid, which I very much enjoyed.
Thank you.
I heard from your conversation with Al Fadi that you were just familiar with Islam for like 3 months or something. Then you dove into a debate with one of the best guys they got, namely Shabir Ali. And when you look at the future that's coming up, I mean, when you look at like declining of Christianity, and hopefully, God willing, that it would also be rising up again, how do you actually foresee the conversations between like this comparative religion realm or arena? How much do you see Islam being quote unquote a threat towards Christianity? Because, for instance, in Holland alone, we have like every other week there's this YouTube channel from Muslims. They're like doing dawah. They're like all the way up there, and like all of a sudden they got, within a week they got like thousands of followers. And there's one Christian dude, none. Like I'm one of the few, as a figure of speech. We got willing. It's not about the numbers, but about the fruits.
Well, it's a scourge. I mean, it's a chastisement for Western apostasy. The irony is that even Western Christians centuries ago understood that Islam is a scourge for when people forsake God. So, I mean, that's clearly what it is. I mean, it really is successful only when people are totally ignorant of their Bible, totally ignorant of the history of the church, totally ignorant of basic philosophy. So we've had such a degradation of education, of pedagogy in the West, that now everyone is just totally susceptible to these really kind of low tier arguments. And I think that Islam really thrives on simplistic low level arguments and ignorance of the Bible mainly. So it's not so much even having, high level philosophical conceptual understanding of the Trinity or metaphysics. I mean, those things are very helpful. They're good skill sets and tools to have in this debate in engaging with Islam. But the main reason that Muslims are so successful is people don't know their Bible. They don't know the doctrine of the Trinity. They can't give a defense of it. And you can't do this without intense knowledge of the Old Testament, because the Trinity doesn't just pop up in John. It's not invented by Paul. It's not invented by Nicaea. It's grounded in the Old Testament. And if you're not saturated with the entirety of Scripture, you're not going to be able to respond to, the guy on the corner who says, "Who is Jesus praying to? How is God greater?" Right? I mean, if we had read Athanasius and Basil, we know how to respond to that, because they dealt with that argument countless times through debating Arians and Eunomians.
Yeah, that's it. Like the level of where Muslims at is such, like, I do know for a fact that within their madrasas, within their mosque, like they are like equipped with polemical, quote unquote, arguments towards Christianity.
Right.
And like we Christians, we don't have a clue. Like the thing about Muslims, they really do think that the West is Christian. And the reason why it's fallen because of corruption, all this type of stuff, like different subject in of itself. I will have Gordon D. Nickel on, one of the best if it comes to Islamic studies. We'll talk about that particular subject. But I do realize that Christians do really need to wake up. And my conviction is that we have already won. I have delved into Islam. I have delved into their theology, and there are so many places they're absolutely stuck. And it's just a matter of getting the win in. And but we can't do this all by ourselves. For instance, like we do need to like invite them. As Gordon D. Nickel says, we need to give them a gentle answer, because a gentle answer turns away wrath. Like we don't want to stir up some animosity, which is a very easy thing to do. Like there's this app called Clubhouse, somewhat the same thing like Discord, for instance. And there are so many discussions going on already, but they are only attacking the Bible. Like one of them is called Ask Muslims. The club is called Ask Muslims. And the only thing they talk about is about Christianity. Like you do really sense from their side, from the atheist side, from the liberal side, there's this anti-Christian agenda going on, which is like very, I don't know how to describe, very fascinated by the anti-Christian spirit. Like it's somewhat, what's the word for it again? It's suspicious. Like why does everybody hate him? Why do you hate him? Like that's something
because it's true. I mean, that's the best explanation for why. I mean, the Bible itself actually explains why everyone hates Christ, because of the fall. So, Romans 1 says that man in his heart of hearts knows that he's a sinner and that he's rebelling against the one true God. But what he does, according to St. Paul, is suppress that knowledge, right? And seek to then stamp out the testimony or witness to God, whether it's in nature, whether it's in the church and Scripture, whether it's in the lives of the saints in the church, or whether it's in his own conscience. Man is against himself, because the only way to be truly man is to be in Christ, who is the archetype of man. He is the new Adam. So that's the only way to be truly human. This is why what happens to fallen man is that he's against himself and against man. So he's divided against himself, and he doesn't realize that he's part of a satanic delusion, which is to destroy his other brothers, mankind. So he's fighting man for Satan. So Satan has duped him. It's kind of like, it makes me think of the analogies that I see in like geopolitics or the conspiracy world of like when like say professors who are super liberal but really devious, they will dupe their students into being activists, and they will hype them up, and they're even like an informant, right? And they get the youthful idiotic activists to go out there and do things, I don't know, some kind of blow something up or something like this, and then they go to prison. The professor, he gets off the hook because he was, FBI informant, handler, or whatever. So he was just doing his job. So he duped them into fighting other humans, right? And he was the sort of mastermind of it for political elites or billionaires or whoever the liberal professor was bought off by or paid by or serving. So that's it's kind of an analogy I'm thinking of what Satan does to get man to destroy man, thinking that he's getting ahead or getting freedom or whatever, when it's all self-destructive and all motivated by the hatred of Christ. Because the reason that Satan hates man is because the incarnation in the Orthodox view was always going to happen. Man was made precisely because the second person of God had intended to take on human nature. And the devil and his angels were envious. They didn't believe that man should be exalted to that position because that would put man above them. Wait a minute. So God is going to join himself to their nature? We're angels. We're above them, right? He made man a little lower than the angels. We should get that, not them. So that there's a solidified hatred that can never change on the part of the demons for humanity, because they see in humanity the image of Christ. That's what it means to be made in the image of God, is literally to be in the image of Christ, according to the Orthodox fathers.
Wow. That really does explain so many things, because I do know for a fact that it exists because I was one, because I had the anti-Christian spirit. I mean, I was the person that was like trying to deviate persons from, so just regular people, deviate them more from Christ, for instance. There was a particular moment where I was just regurgitating like the basic atheist premises or the thing, which was like, I don't know, 17, like I already mentioned before, like I did watch Zeitgeist and Parallelomania and it's from Horace and these type of stuff. And I'm like, I just want to whack myself thinking about it. But I do know.
Well, we're all born into the world with that spirit, that rebellious spirit. So I think everybody in varying, I mean, some people obviously can be, cleansed and brought into the church very young, sure. But everybody to some degree, being a son of Adam, we have that rebellious spirit in us at some point. And most people go through a phase, when they're in their teens or in their 20s where they, experiment and go try other things. And so it happens, I think, to everybody. And I can remember when I was a teenager, I don't even remember consciously, like I didn't wake up one day to be like, I am not going to be a Christian. But I remember just having very kind of wicked thoughts and very anti-Christian thoughts. And I don't even know where they came from. It's just, I would have these thoughts and I would, like you said, kind of agree with anybody going against Christians just because I thought it was funny and cool in high school. And they're a bunch of nerds, what a bunch of idiots. And I don't even know, I didn't have a good reason. It was just like, yeah, well, whatever, screw them.
Yeah. That's, yeah.
Well, then I think that's because if we're not in Christ, seeking him, etc., in the church, participating in the sacraments, we are then opened up to the influence of the demonic. I mean, we can be influenced by the demonic even in the church. I mean, people in the church who, for example, get tripped up in heresies or get super self-righteous about their fasting or whatever, those are demonic delusions too. So even if we can be under demonic delusion and spiritual influence in the church, so absolutely, even more so can we be outside the church. We're just prey for, all manner of wicked influences.
Thank the Lord that he has been gracious towards us. I really do that, and that he has become patient with us. Like you do really understand, like Romans 8:28, like all things work together for the good of God, like even the bad things and the good things. And something like one of the men who actually did influence me was Jordan Peterson. And one of his last conversations he had is the word he actually uses for Christ which he like says he weirdly believes, is that he is terrifying. And I do believe the fact that a lot of atheists, a lot of people who have like this anti-Christian spirit in them are terrified of him, because if this whole stuff, if this stuff is true, which we do believe is true, then yeah, that the second person of the Trinity has become incarnate, has to put all the sin on himself, that he is the judge. Like if all of this is true, what type of implication does this have for everyone? And that's something terrifying.
Yeah, well, it means we have to change the way we are, we live, and a lot of people don't want to change that. So exactly. I mean, Jesus says it really well in John 3, right? He says that the light came into the world, and the world hates the light because it wants to remain in darkness.
Correct.
And he says, so the wicked don't come to the light lest its deeds be exposed. So they would rather remain in darkness because they're, prisoners to the darkness.
Yeah. Not everybody likes the light.
And part of that is fear, right? They're afraid that they, will lose who they are. They won't be the same person, but that's all also demonic delusion, right? I mean, I just keep more and more thinking about, and it's becoming more and more evident in our world, just how powerful and obvious it is that it's demonic, right? I mean, it's just so obvious that all of the things that are being promoted from the top down, they're not just social engineering, it is, but they're ultimately demonic in origin, because the only way to make sense of all of it is to figure out, oh, actually it's a top-down thing that is anti-human. And what is anti-human? Principally Satan, right? I mean, Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, they don't have the wherewithal and the power to organize an entire spirit, right, that has diluted the globe, but Satan does. So, understanding that it goes beyond the human dimension has much more explanatory power than, just looking at things at a geopolitical level and saying, oh, well, there's like, really wealthy people who want to depopulate. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to a degree, but it's still lacking in like, well, how are they able to, get everybody on board with things that are, for example, self-destructive? I mean, it goes beyond merely human machination is what I'm trying to say. And therefore, when you look at the spiritual domain or level above that, it makes much more sense.
Yeah. That even the most powerful people on earth are also like influenced. But that's the whole thing. Like once you can convince atheists of the metaphysical spiritual side that the thing we fight with are not of the flesh and blood. These are the spiritual domain, like Paul says in Ephesians 6, hence the full armor apologetics. It's not about that I'm going to step into the ring. It's about the spiritual battle we're going into. But you cannot address a problem if you're not acknowledge it first. And you once already mentioned before, like the problems we have in this world are not solved politically, but spiritually. And and Paul says in Romans 12 too, like it's by the renewing of your mind. The constant renewing of your mind. And that's what we're trying to do. Like what you're doing before, for instance, with edifying Christians all over the world. Like you're reading books, you're giving lectures, you're explicating everything. Like Christians who are like not that steady in their faith do now. And we need more of that. So yet again, a lot of respect for you and your work. May God grant you all the best that he has to offer for you. May God bless you with health, with vigor, with more wisdom. May we become like him. And Brother Jay, what can I say? I wish you the very best. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely.
I had absolutely great time. And are there any final remarks from your side before ending this?
Not that I can think of. If people are interested, you can go to my channel. You can follow me on Rockfin, which is a great free speech-based platform, because obviously we don't know how long, the president, YouTube, and all that's going to allow us to be here. You can follow me on the other social medias and all that. And just happy to, keep churning out all this stuff. And I'm glad it's beneficial.
Yeah. I most definitely will also have the links in the description. Can I say then, everyone, thanks for watching thus far. May we also be as prolific and as fruitful if it comes to this channel. May we give everybody over the world the message of what the Bible has to offer. All the glory to our triune God. So, Brother Jay, thank you very much, brother.
Awesome. Thank you, man. Have a good night.
Yeah.